The noon sun hung like a tarnished coin over Valor's rest, and the desert wind came on with the taste of old iron and funeral dust. The kind of wind that made your tongue remember every mistake you'd ever spoken aloud. Lila Hart stepped down from the stagecoach in a travel-worn blue dress, one gloved hand on her valise, the other bracing against a gust that made the signboard creak. Valor's Rest, 1876. The letters looked carved by a tired god and left to fade. She swallowed. A church bell counted one, then gave up like a man too proud to ask for air. The stagecoach rattled off in a cloud of yellow grit, leaving her framed in stillness that wasn't peace. The platform boards quivered faintly beneath her boots, tired of holding travelers who never quite arrived anywhere worth staying. Heat warped the air. The horizon looked like it might spill if she stared long enough. News met her before welcome. The station master came from the telegraph shack, wiping his hands on a ledger that hadn't been honest in years. His eyes were rimmed red from wind and whiskey-bitten sleep, and the skin around them hung loose, as though even the bones beneath had grown skeptical of living out here. "Your uncle, Miss Hart, the one you come to live with, he's gone under," he said. The words hit like a hammer dropped flat. "Drowned, they say. Checking a sluice gate up at Dead Mare Wash. 2 nights back." Ugh. There was a pause that tried to be tender and failed. "You want the eastbound, ma'am. It leaves at sunup." The world narrowed to the rim of her bonnet. A note of violin tightened in her throat and would not resolve. She had crossed a continent to find a roof and a name she could stand on. Instead, she found water that killed, and a town that had already decided how to forget. For a long moment she said nothing. The dust climbed her hem, claiming her by inches. She felt absurdly sorry for the hem it had survived 5 states of mud, soot, and rain, only to die of indifference here. Across the platform, a broad-shouldered man lifted 2 sacks of grain as if they were his own regrets carefully, without ceremony. He wore a plain coat, sun-sobered, and a hat whose brim had learned the shape of honest weather. When the station master's words broke off, the man looked over, not curious so much as awake to trouble. He set the grain down. "Miss Hart?" he asked, voice low, as if it might spook a skittish horse. "Name's Elias Kane." They told her later he had served with the cavalry and left part of himself in the Badlands, a night's sleep, a friend, and the habit of walking unarmed into hurt. She saw none of that now, only a steadiness that made room for her to stand. "My uncle," she managed. "They said—" "I heard," Elias said. "I'm sorry for it." He tipped his hat toward the unpitying horizon. "Dead Mare Wash ain't kind. Some men say it's the water takes you. Some say it's the men who own it." A laugh caught sharp in her mouth. "Which men is that?" He held her gaze a fraction too long and then looked to the dust. "Depends on which church you ask." The station master shuffled his feet, grateful for any distraction from grief he couldn't drink. "You'll need somewhere to stay, miss," he muttered. "Town ain't much for women traveling alone." "I'll manage," Lila said automatically, though her voice cracked on the lie. Wind bellied the canvas of the coach as it disappeared. Somewhere a dog complained about nothing and everything. Elias nodded toward the boardwalk. "My sister Ruth keeps a house on Cotton Street," he said. "Respectable. If you'd allow it, I'll see you there. You can rest the day, and we'll set your choices out straight by lamplight, not by gossip." "Lou." Lila should have said she was fine, that Philadelphia had raised her to her feet, and she could stand on them yet. But the city had also taught her to recognize decency when it spoke without embellishment. Pride felt useless here, like lace on a coffin. Out here, even the bell gave up at one. She followed him. The walk was short, the world long. Valor's Rest had a split soul. Painted storefronts beside shacks, a church with a cracked crossbeam, a saloon with new paint as raw as a lie. Men looked away too casually. Women watched with the precise mercy of those who kept families alive by counting pennies and seconds. A poster flapped on a post, "Stock Men's Association meeting tonight, water rights discussion." Someone had stabbed it with a penknife through the word rights. The street carried a faint metallic hum, like guilt left too long in the Sunday. Lila tried to match her breath to her steps, but grief has its own rhythm. Every block of wood and nail seemed to lean on some old betrayal. You get used to the wind, Elias said quietly as they walked. You never stop hearing it, but after a while you stop arguing with it. She nodded. I didn't think the West would feel unfinished. He smiled a little. That's the charm and the curse. Everything here's still being invented, including the truth. End quote. They turned down Cotton Street, where the houses looked like tired women in good dresses, upright but worn at the seams. Laundry fluttered on lines, the white sheets snapping like surrender flags. Chickens wandered between the boards, heads darting with quick, nervous judgment. Ruth Kane opened her door with a dish towel in one hand and judgment in none. She was 30-something and carried widowhood like a book she had read twice, first in tears, then in calm. "Comin' out the wind, honey," she said, not asking for proof. The sitting room smelled of coffee and soap. It was the cleanest place Lila had seen since the Mississippi. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Ruth set a cup in Lila's hands. Heat went through to bone. Elias stayed near the door, hat in both hands like a man who knew rooms were private countries. Lila told them what she knew, which was hardly anything. A letter 6 weeks old. Her uncle's scrawl softened by good news. We'll have you teaching the little ones by autumn. Lila girl, and the ticket he'd paid for with hope. Ruth listened without gasping. Elias looked like a man taking the measure of a fence line after a storm. Dead Mare Wash, Ruth said at last. Feeds 3 ranches, and one of those ranches thinks it bought the sky. Stanton Creed signs the banknotes and lets his men do the talking. Lila's fingers tightened on the cup. They called it an accident. Accidents are cheaper than truth, Ruth said, and folded the towel as if she were putting a day to bed. Silence filled the room, not empty but crowded with the ghost of all the things people here had learned not to say. Lila tried to imagine her uncle's last day, the rasp of rope, the churn of muddy water, the way his hand might have reached for air that wasn't there. A kind man, stubborn in arithmetic, who wrote once that figures never lie, only the men behind them. She wondered what figures had killed him. Outside, a wagon rattled past. A harmonica failed at a tune and tried again. The smell of coffee settled into her hair, as if the room meant to claim her. Elias spoke finally. If you're set on staying through the night, Ruth'll make room. She's good at keeping storms outside where they belong. Lila met his eyes. They were blue the way winter skies are distant, honest, and not made for soft things. You're kind, Mr. Kane. Not kind, he said, almost embarrassed. Just raised decent. Ruth poured more coffee into Lila's cup, though she hadn't finished the first. Eat something, dear. Grief runs hotter than fever. It'll wear you out if you let it. Mare. The stew she brought was humble and perfect potatoes that remembered the earth, carrots that believed in sweetness. Lila ate with the slow, careful motion of someone rediscovering the idea of hunger. When the dishes were cleared, Ruth fetched a small quilted bundle. It was your uncle's, she said, setting it on the table. They brought it down from the wash, his watch, a few papers, and this. Inside lay a folded map, edges soft with handling. A faint pencil mark circled Dead Mare Wash, and beside it a note. Flow must be measured weekly. Ask Kane. Lila looked up sharply. You knew him? Elias nodded. We traded water rights once, back when the rains were kinder. He was a fair man. He didn't drown easy. Something in his tone made her spine straighten. You think someone helped him drown? I think, Elias said carefully. There's men out here who prefer quiet creeks and quiet witnesses. Ruth shot him a look. Eli, don't go turning supper into sermon. He shrugged, but said no more. The lamp hissed, flame bending toward the open window as if it, too, wanted out. The silence that followed was not unkind. It simply allowed breathing. Lila sat very still, the quilt rough beneath her palms. The West, she realized, was not the blank slate she had imagined. It was already written over with debts, promises, and ghosts who still kept their appointments. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller but steadier. East held nothing but a narrow room and the slow death of respectability. West holds a grave and a question. She surprised herself by smiling faintly. I think I prefer the question. Elias cleared his throat. almost apologetic. "Miss Hart, I keep a small spread 5 miles out Kane's Mercy. I could use a hand that can add proper. Books are honest when men ain't. There's a schoolroom wanting paint and little boots wanting letters. Room and board. Wages fair. Month's trial. You'll have your own door to close." He paused, and his gaze softened. "If it doesn't suit, I'll see you to the eastbound myself." He said it like a promise cut from oak. Lila searched his face for the rope and hook that usually swung behind such offers, found only a built-in sorrow and a willingness to carry weight that wasn't his. "Why?" she asked. "Because a good man once pulled me out of a dry creek and never sent me a bill," Elias said. "And because your uncle should have met you at that platform and didn't. A man ought to keep the things he says." Ruth touched Lila's sleeve. "You'll be safe with us." Safety. A word that used to mean parlors and lamp music and letters in careful hands. Here, it meant a roof that didn't leak. A man who looked away when you cried. A woman who slid you a plate without counting. Lila lifted the cup again and let the heat tell her what to do. By sundown, she had a room, the smallest one upstairs, where the wallpaper had faded to the color of a held breath. Through the window, she could see the top of the church steeple, crooked against the wide sky like a plea that had lost its address. She sat on the edge of the bed and unpacked her valise slowly. 2 dresses, 1 book of Psalms, her mother's comb, and a letter that began, "My dear Lila girl," and ended with, "You'll do fine out here, if you remember who you are." She folded it again and again, until it was the size of courage. Downstairs, someone laughed a sound too ordinary for morning. She realized with a kind of surprise that she was grateful for it. The world had not ended, only changed its handwriting. When night fell, the desert cooled fast. Crickets tuned the dark, and far off, the wash murmured like a witness trying to forget. Lila stood by the window, the stars raw and merciless above her. She thought of her uncle somewhere beneath that same indifferent moon, and of the man downstairs who spoke like wood grain plain, sturdy, unwilling to lie. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would decide. But even as she thought it, her heart had already leaned west. By moonrise, she had chosen to walk into morning without a ticket home. The sky over Valor's Rest was too wide for eastbound trains. Kane's Mercy looked smaller than its name and more faithful. A low house with a wide porch, a barn with shoulders like a tired ox, corrals scribbled in wire, and Sunday, morning light found everything and forgave most of it. Lila rode beside Elias in a wagon that was more repairs than wood. He drove loose-handed, as if reins were a conversation, not an order. The road curled between sagebrush and rock, both trying and failing to look like home. The air smelled of hay, dust, and some quiet promise. Crows balanced on fence posts, black punctuation against the vast grammar of the plains. Every few minutes, the wagon's axle sighed, complaining of the years since its last mercy. Lila didn't mind. The slow rhythm steadied her heartbeat. It gave the silence a shape she could rest inside. Elias spoke only once, when a hawk shadow crossed their path. "Out here, the only thing flies higher than birds is gossip," he said. She smiled faintly. "Then we'd best keep our words close to the ground." He nodded, and that was all. The man seemed built from the same wood as the land. Quiet grain, no varnish, weathered by both sun and conscience. Inside the house, the bones were good and the breath was weary. A mantle dusted in days, a ledger with numbers that had tried to behave and failed, shelves of canning jars like a choir with no hymn. Lila set her valise down and rolled her sleeves. There are griefs that call for prayer and those that call for hot water. This was the second kind. She found a broom in the corner, bristles splayed like an old soldier's beard, and began. Dust rose and danced, reluctant to leave. The floorboards creaked at her touch as though surprised by gentleness. In the kitchen, she opened windows that hadn't known air in months. Wind came in shy at first, then bold, smelling of alfalfa and thunder kept too long in a bottle. By noon, windows were up. Rugs were whipped into straight talk. The stove admitted it could shine. Lila found the ledger and a stub of pencil. The columns came to heel under a firmer hand. Feed, salt, wages, a note about a pump that lied every third day. She wrote a small, neat truth in the margin. Pay Miguel on time. Pay yourself in sleep. Then she went out to meet the land. Elias was at the north fence with Miguel Delgado, a man whose hat brim had learned the art of shade. They were laughing over a nail that wanted to be a horseshoe. Elias spotted her, lifted a hand, and did not stare at the sunlight on her hair. She liked him for that. The days that followed took shape like clay under patient hands. Mornings began with the groan of the pump and the smell of biscuits that came out square because the oven leaned. Lila learned the temper of the stove, the songs of boards under her feet, the precise sigh of coffee poured at dawn. Afternoons belonged to work and dust, laundry, ledger, lessons, the ordinary heroism of living somewhere too honest for dreams. Miguel and his wife Rosa lived in a small shack near the barn, and they treated Lila like kin who'd lost the same war. Rosa was broad in shoulder, soft in heart, and always humming something half-remembered. She taught Lila how to keep bread from sulking in the dry air and how to read a storm by the smell of sage. "Desert don't hate you," Rosa said once, kneading dough with a rhythm older than speech. "She just don't know your name yet." In the evenings, they all sat on the porch. Elias, rolling tobacco he rarely smoked, Miguel carving bits of cedar into small animals for the children, Rosa braiding Lila's stray thoughts into stories of the land. The sky turned bruised purple before it forgave itself into night. When Lila wasn't working, she wrote lessons on scraps of old bills. Letters curved like seeds, numbers stood like fence posts. She tacked the makeshift board on 2 barrels and called it a school because no one else would. The children came in 2s and 3s, Miguel's boy Tomas, his shy sister Lupe, the orphaned twins from the neighbor's spread, and any soul small enough to still believe in letters. They sat cross-legged in the dirt, faces solemn, hands smudged. Lila sang time for them, low and plain, the way her mother had back in Philadelphia. The children looked at her, as if words were doors. Sometimes Elias came in early with a forgotten hammer or a question about the price of oats, news he could have asked the grocer but preferred to hear from her mouth. He'd stand there, a little too big for the doorway, and nod at whatever she said like it was clean water. Once he brought wildflowers so awkwardly she pretended not to see them until supper, and then put them in a chipped glass with ceremony. He flushed, which made his scars look young. In those weeks, silence became their grammar. They spoke in half-sentences, glances, the sharing of work. When the sun pressed too hard on the fields, they carried supper to the porch and let the twilight work on them. Lila learned the names of the hills: Saddleback, Widow's Tooth, The Bend, where coyotes laugh, and how a man can love a place without owning 1 more inch of it. Elias learned that a woman who could balance books could also balance a child on her hip and a grief behind her eyes, and that both weights were holy. Once, near dusk, Lila found him fixing the pump that lied every third day. She brought him water, stayed to watch. His hands moved sure and patient. "You always fix what breaks?" she asked. "When I can," he said. "And when I can't, I mend what's left." She thought about that long after he'd gone to put away his tools. The first trouble arrived dressed like a favor. A rider came through at noon, vest clean, boots unscuffed, a look about him like he'd never bent to tie anything heavier than his ego. He tipped his hat and handed over a folded paper as if it were a dance card. Stockmen's Association notice of voluntary contribution to maintain ditches and sluices and keep the peace. Elias read it once, twice, a third time for the lie in the middle. "Voluntary," he said, and the word tasted like brackish water. He signed nothing. The rider smiled like a man who'd just been told no by a woman he thought beneath him. "Most folks around here understand that paying's easier than explaining." Elias wiped his hands on his trousers and said evenly, "Explaining's honest work. I don't mind it." The rider left a trail of offended dust. A week later, a sluice downstream of Kane's Mercy, clogged with brush and trash that didn't grow there. The creek ran thin. The young cottonwoods along the lower paddock bent as if listening to a bad story. Miguel swore in a language that made sense to the desert. Elias shouldered a shovel. Lila fetched rope and will. They cleared it together under a sky that couldn't be bothered to help. The water came back slow, like a tired animal returning home, grateful, unashamed. Elias stood knee-deep in the mud, pushing at the debris, while Lila worked the rope from shore, her skirts soaked to the bone. When the current finally righted itself, she laughed aloud, a sound the desert didn't know how to echo. That night, Elias sat on the steps long after the lamp went out. Lila stood in the doorway, the dark laying its cool hand on her brow, and understood. The West doesn't hate you, it just doesn't care. Men do the caring, or nobody does. She wrote a letter she would never send, to the uncle who should have been there to scold her for blisters and praise her column. "Uncle," she wrote, "I am learning that faith and arithmetic aren't opposites after all. Both require belief in invisible balances. And here, sometimes, the ledger of right and wrong gets paid in water, not gold." She sealed it with the crease of her palm and placed it under the ledger, a private ceremony of the living. Sunday brought church white paint failing bravely and a potluck where even the beans had opinions. The whole town came, weathered men in coats that had seen both wars and weddings, women in faded bonnets that had outlived husbands, children in mismatched shoes chased dogs too old to care. Afterward, Lila played the small parlor organ, coaxing out a hymn that remembered different words in Philadelphia. When she lifted her hands, she felt eyes on her. Kind ones, hungry ones, measuring ones. Ruth squeezed her shoulder. "Folks listen harder when beauty hurts a little," Ruth whispered. "Yours does." Stanton Creed came up then, a smell of fine tobacco and easy harm. His smile was winter thin. "Miss Hart, we're honored to have such talent among us." He tipped his hat to Elias without seeing him. "Mr. Kane, I trust the notice reached you." "It did," Elias said. "And?" "We still read slow at my place," Elias said. "But we read true." Creed's eyes cooled. "True costs. See you at the meeting, neighbor." He walked away, boots not scuffing a thing. The crowd shifted uneasily. Lila watched the man's back and saw the shape of entitlement, the kind that believed rivers and people both should run where he pointed. That evening, when the wind came right, Lila heard the far-off clank of metal on rock, like men laying a rude spine through the wash. She went to the porch. Elias stood there already, watching the western dark receive its secrets. "We'll have to stand up," she said. "We will," he answered, as if naming the weather. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. Not yet. The next morning dawned mean with heat. Lila found herself awake before the rooster, the air thick enough to chew. From the window, she watched Elias hitch the team, his movements precise, unhurried. A man who had learned to measure every motion against survival. By noon, they rode to town for supplies. At the general store, whispers followed them soft, curious, not unkind. Word had traveled, the teacher and the rancher who stood up to Creed. Lila pretended not to hear, but Ruth, arranging tins on a shelf, shot her a look that was half pride, half warning. "Names travel faster than wagons," Ruth said later over coffee. "Be sure yours rides with good company." That night the wind came from the south, carrying the smell of rain that never arrived. The world held its breath. In the distance, thunder crawled across the hills like something half-tame. Elias sat on the porch rail, guitar in hand, plucking strings out of memory. The melody stumbled, found itself, then wandered again. Lila leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You play," she said. "Poorly," he admitted. "Poorly's better than silence." He glanced at her, half a smile ghosting his lips. Some silences earn their keep. She sat beside him. The horizon flickered lightning, stitching sky to ground for one brief heartbeat. The sound arrived seconds later, deep and honest. "What made you stay here?" she asked. "This land's too harsh for most men." He thought a while before answering. "Because it doesn't pretend to love you, it just lets you prove you belong." Lila nodded, and somewhere in her chest, something unbroken stirred. When she went to bed, she left the window open. The night smelled of dust and change, and far beyond the fields, Dead Mare Wash whispered its old story, one they were no longer willing to ignore. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from if you love stories of the last West town. The night it broke, The wind swung south and brought the smell of tin and men who believed in other people's property. Rosa heard it first, the false clatter of a gate, the mule's offended snort, and then the glow, low and greedy, along the barn's eaves. Rosa shouted. Miguel was already running. Lila came up from her ledger with the knowledge that a number had just turned into a flame. Elias reached the yard in 3 strides. Fire picks its favorites and goes for wood that remembers sap. The eaves licked up. Sparks leapt like debt come due. "Bucket line," Rosa cried. Elias hauled the pump as if it were a man he could not leave behind. Lila ran to the well, dress hitched without shame, hands stinging against the rope. Water came slow, as if the earth had opinions about spending. A shadow moved where shadows shouldn't. Lila turned and saw him, a boy no older than the alphabet she taught, face tied up in a scarf, eyes snared in fear. He carried a tin of coal oil like guilt. She did not scream. "Son," she said, voice low, teacher, plain. "Set that down and help or run home to your mother and tell her what your hands learned tonight." He froze. His chest worked like a trapped bird. Then something in her tone, some memory of a woman's stern kindness, broke the wire. He dropped the tin and fell into line between Miguel and Lila, passing sloshing life hand to hand, eyes leaking smoke and shame. The fire found less to love. Elias climbed the ladder with a wet blanket, a dark cutout against orange. For a moment Lila thought the night would keep him. He hammered the blanket down over the eave and swore like prayer. The flame stuttered, chose another corner, died where it stood. Heat retreated in sullen inches. When the worst of it was over, the boy vanished like a lesson learned too late. Lila didn't chase. Elias came off the ladder wrong, landed and favored his left leg with a wince he tried to bury. Lila crossed the yard in 3 heartbeats and set her hands on him without asking, like a wife in a life not yet written. "Sit," she said. He Saturday. Rosa brought a strip of linen and something that burned sweeter than whiskey. They worked in silence that was family. Wind worried the last sparks into black. Stars came back one by one, surprised to find they could. "Creed," Miguel said finally, like a diagnosis. "Creed." Elias agreed, like a promise. Lila washed the ash from Elias's hand. The scars on his knuckles were old stories that didn't brag. He watched her do it, face open in a way that made her chest ache. "You could still take the eastbound," he said, like a man who honors freedom even when it cuts him. She smiled, tired and truer than she'd ever been. "And miss the arithmetic of this place?" "I think not." They laughed then, because tears would have cost too much water. Later, when the house slept and the barn kept its uneasy truce with what had almost taken it, Lila stepped onto the porch. The boards were still warm from the fire's memory. Elias followed, limp a little heavier, eyes a little clearer. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the kind of distance that is less than it looks. "Why did you come west?" he asked, the question finally due. "Because east was a slow drowning," she said, "and I wanted to hear my name said without pity." He nodded. "Lila Hart," he said into the dark, giving her what she'd asked without touching her. She turned to him then, something decided. "Elias." He faced her. For a few seconds all the unspoken years walked between them and refused to pass. She reached up, laid her fingers along his jaw where ash had settled into the daily stubble, and found a tremor there that was not fear. "Thank you," she said, meaning the house, the day, the dignity, the way he let her be brave. He caught her hand, not trapping it, just sheltering, and breathed like a man who has been under water and is remembering air. "I keep thinking," he said, "that a man ought to offer the truth before the gift." She kissed him. It wasn't young or practiced. It was the clean answer after a long, long math. When they parted, the desert was listening. "Marry me," he said, "not to win, not to own, but to build. Not tonight, not from fear. When we've made this right with the town, when water runs honest, when we can stand up in the same light without ducking. I'll ask you again before a preacher and a sky." She could have said later. She could have said, "Let's live in the almost." Instead she nodded, "Because some vows you make before there are witnesses, so the world has to catch up." "Ask me when the water runs honest," she said. "I will." In the morning, a note was tacked to the corral post. "Mistakes happen on rough nights. Let smart men handle big problems." SC. Elias read it, folded it twice, and put it in his pocket like a debt. The next day dawned mean and clean. The barn was a half-burned sermon on the cost of decency. Black ribs of timber jutted skyward like the bones of an old creature that had fought well and lost politely. Miguel walked the perimeter, muttering prayers and curses that shared a rhythm. Rosa shoveled out the ash in silence, face wet but not from tears. Lila helped where she could, sweeping, hauling, writing notes of what could be salvaged. By midday, the heat made every motion an argument with breath. Elias leaned on his crutch of stubbornness, refusing to sit. When Lila finally pressed a cup of water into his hand, he took it with a nod that was half surrender. "Why won't you rest?" she asked. "Because he won't," Elias said, looking toward the horizon where the wash cut a dark seam through the plain. "Creed don't rest. He waits. That's worse." The wind shifted. The smell of burned hay rode up from the field. "Then we'll wait louder," she said. That earned her a smile. By sunset, the damage was counted, the animals calmed, the town notified. Sheriff Dwyer came by, hat in hand, mouth full of sympathy he didn't quite believe. "No proof it was Creed's men," he said. "Could have been drifters." "Drifters don't leave calling cards," Elias replied, tapping his pocket. Dwyer sighed. "You want my advice, let it cool. Creed's got lawyers like snakes, have teeth. Justice don't move quick out here." Lila's voice was calm. "Neither do floods. But when they come, they remember every stone." The sheriff tipped his hat, uncertain whether he'd been comforted or warned, and rode off into the dark. That night, the Kane house became a triage ward for both injury and faith. Rosa wrapped Elias's leg, humming a hymn from Mexico that sounded like forgiveness, learning to walk. Miguel took first watch with the rifle, eyes on the horizon. Lila stayed inside, recopying the ranch ledgers by lamplight. The ink bled a little from her shaking hand. She kept thinking of the boy, the scarf, the eyes, the way he had looked at her when she said help or run home. Somewhere, a mother was waiting up, praying for a son who might never tell the truth about what he'd done. When sleep finally came, it came like mercy earned, not granted. In the days that followed, word spread faster than flies. Valor's rest liked a story, and this one came with all the right ingredients: fire, defiance, and Creed's name. The saloon filled with whispers. Men spoke in the language of half-truths and cheap whiskey. Some said the boy was Creed's kin. Others said Elias had set the fire himself for attention. Lila ignored it all, but Ruth didn't. She came out to Kane's mercy with a basket of bread and the kind of anger only widows can afford. "He's spreading rot through town," Ruth said, setting down the basket like a challenge. "You need to bring it to light before it festers." Elias wiped his hands on his jeans. "Light takes time, Ruth. It's got to be earned." "Then earn it fast," she snapped. "Before the next fire does." Lila stepped forward. "Maybe we can find the boy again. If he's willing to speak." Ruth nodded. "Find him, before Creed does." The search took days. They rode from homestead to homestead, asking careful questions. It was Miguel who spotted him first, near the edge of town, sitting on a fence post with his hat pulled low. When he saw them, he flinched like a rabbit. Elias dismounted slowly, palms open. "You did what you were told, son. Now you get to do what's right." The boy's voice cracked. "They said it was just to scare you. Said nobody'd get hurt." "They lied," Lila said softly. "That's what men like that do. But you can end it. You saw who gave the order?" He nodded. "Creed's foreman. Big fella with a scar through his lip. Called me kid. Will you tell that to the sheriff?" The boy swallowed. "Will you be there?" "I will," said Lila without hesitation. He nodded, eyes wide with the kind of courage that trembles. By the time the sun fell, a statement was signed. Sheriff Dwyer read it twice, his face unreadable. "You're poking a hornet's nest," he said finally. "Then I hope they sting honest," Elias answered. That night, Valor's rest held its breath. Men gathered outside the saloon, waiting for Creed to appear. When he did, he looked unbothered, dressed in his best coat, cigar smoldering like a sermon no one asked for. "You've been busy, Kane," he said, voice lazy as molasses. "Teaching schoolmarms how to throw buckets and boys how to lie." Elias stood steady. "I teach what's true. Some folks just flunk the class." Creed's smile thinned. You'll regret making me your curriculum." "Oh." Before anyone could blink, Lila stepped forward. "No, Mr. Creed. We're just grading fairly for once." The crowd laughed uneasy, half afraid, but grateful for the moment someone had named the bully out loud. Creed's eyes went cold. "You're learning quick, Miss Hart. Be careful you don't graduate too soon." He walked off, leaving smoke that smelled like threat. Elias turned to her. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "That's why I did." For the first time, he didn't argue. Days turned into weeks, the ranch mending in small acts. New boards on the barn, mended rope, laughter at supper. But Valor's rest wasn't done with them. Rumors thickened like storm clouds. Dwyer came out again this time with a subpoena. Creed had filed a complaint for slander. "Court'll be next month," the sheriff said. "You'll need proof." Elias exhaled slow. "We've got truth. That'll do." After he left, Lila set her hand on Elias's arm. "He's not after law. He's after time. Every day we spend defending ourselves is one he spends digging new ditches." Elias looked at her with quiet pride. "Then we'll learn to fight two wars at once, one with paper, one with patience." That night they sat by the rebuilt barn, watching the lanterns sway. Lila leaned her head against the post, eyes closed. "You think justice ever wins out here?" "Not often," he said. "But sometimes it stays standing long enough for the next soul to see it." She smiled. "Then we'll keep it upright." "Oh." He looked at her, and in the warm silence that followed, something settled, something like belonging. A week later, Dawn came wearing gold and ash. A rider brought a telegram from Santa Fe. The territorial judge was traveling through Valor's Rest to hear Creed's case personally. The town buzzed like a hive knocked over. Some hoped for justice. Others bet on the opposite. Lila spent the day organizing the ledger, page after page of careful proof. Rainfall, sluice schedules, missing sums. She found comfort in the order of ink, in the arithmetic of truth. At dusk, Elias came in with a limp heavier than usual. "They've started reinforcing the upper wash," he said. "Steel pipes, not drainage control." "Then he's still stealing." "Worse," Elias said. "He's planning to make it legal." The fire that night was long cold, but its ghost flickered behind her eyes. "Then we burn him down in daylight," she said. He smiled at that, a tired, dangerous smile. Outside, the wind shifted north again. Somewhere in the dark, water whispered its restless hymn, waiting for honest hands to turn it back toward grace. The courthouse in Valor's Rest had once been a feed store, and it still smelled faintly of oats and forgotten ambition. The windows, too high for comfort, leaked sunlight in narrow, honest stripes that made dust dance like nervous witnesses. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, hats twisting in their hands, faces half eager, half ashamed for wanting to see another man fall. Outside, the wind prowled the street, but didn't enter the kind of wind that waits to see who wins before picking up its direction. Somebody had chalked "court" on the door plank, the letters blocky and earnest, as if by naming the room you could persuade justice to sit a little straighter. Someone else had scrubbed at a dark stain on the floor, spilled molasses, Sheriff Dwyer said, though no one believed him. The benches were rough and remembered grain. A crate by the back wall still wore the ghost of a seed, company brand. The place hadn't been built to weigh souls, only feed mules. But out here the same roof often did both. Lila sat in the front pew, fingers tight on the ledger that had lived under her pillow for 2 weeks straight. Inside it were the arithmetic bones of justice columns, dates, and careful ink lines, proving that water, the town's very breath, had been bought, rerouted, and stolen under the name of association dues. Each entry had been copied by her hand in the small, exacting script of a schoolteacher who knows truth is a matter of penmanship as much as courage. She could feel Elias beside her, still as carved wood. He wore his one clean shirt, sleeves rolled just once, collar starched into decency. He looked as though he'd shaved for Judgment Day. Rosa sat behind them with Miguel. Ruth flanked Lila's other side, all flint and prayer. The judge, a traveling circuit man with a Bible-thin patience, rapped the gavel against the counter that used to hold seed sacks. Court of Territorial Law, 4th District, now in session. Matter of the people, versus Stanton Creed. The crowd breathed as one, the sound low and hard like wind against wire. Stanton Creed stepped forward, too polished for the room, his boots, the color of money, and his mustache trimmed with a barber's confidence. He nodded to the judge, smiled at the crowd, as though this were merely another harvest to oversee. A man used to owning the air never quite forgets the habit. His lawyer, a gray-suited wasp with careful hair and a habit of checking his watch for permission to live, placed a slim leather folio on the table and patted it like a well-fed dog. Sheriff Dwyer stood to read the charges, voice flat as a board. Illegal diversion of water from Dead Mare Wash, construction of unlicensed sluices, conspiracy to defraud the ranchers of Valor's Rest. He paused on the last count, looking directly at Creed, and causing harm to life and property through willful negligence. His eyes flicked to Elias and Lila for the briefest moment, the barn fire still fresh in the town's lungs. Creed's lawyer rose. "Your Honor, before we proceed, we move to dismiss on the grounds that jurisdiction is improperly—" "Sit down," said the judge gently, the way a man talks to a skittish horse. "You'll have your turn, counselor. For now, the witnesses." Ruth was first. She told of the night the fire took half the barn, of the young boy seen running with a can of oil, and how the boy's mother had begged silence until guilt won out. Her voice never trembled. She'd buried a husband to fever and didn't scare easy. The lawyer tried to tangle her. "Mrs. Miller, you saw a figure, not a face." Ruth cut him off without raising her voice. "I saw a boy who needed saving more than scolding. I also saw flame where no lightning had been." The courtroom held its breath. Ruth nodded once and stepped down. Then came Miguel, hat in hand, swearing he'd seen Creed's riders by lantern light near the upper wash, cutting a channel where no channel ought to be. His accent thickened with anger. His words came like stones skipping fast across a pond. The lawyer circled. "Mr. Delgado, night is unkind to certainty. You claim you recognize these men. How precisely?" Miguel didn't blink. "By how they sat their horses lazy, like thieves who believe no one is watching. By the scar through the foreman's lip. By the way they laughed when water turned wrong." Rosa wept quietly in the back, pride and pain braided together. The lawyer smirked. "You have keen eyes, Mr. Delgado. Yet you did not intervene." Miguel's mouth went flat. "I have children. I picked the fight I could win, remembering." A murmur rippled across the benches. The judge let it crest and fade. Then came Lila. The judge motioned her to the stand, and as she rose, the room hushed to the sound of her boots against wood. She placed the ledger on the table with care, as if it might bruise. The clerk held up a book missing half its spine. "State your name." "Oh, wait." "Lila Hart," she said. "Occupation?" "Teacher. Bookkeeper at Kane's Mercy Ranch." "Do you swear to tell the truth?" "I do," she said, and added softly, "It's all I have." Her testimony unfurled like measured breath. She spoke of creek levels and rain gauges fashioned from straight-sided jars, marked in ink and faith. She described dates and headgate settings, the mismatched sums in Creed's supposed maintenance fees. She pointed to pages, finger steady, and the numbers stood at attention. She had no talent for performance, which made her irresistible, truth wearing its work clothes. Creed's lawyer tried to interrupt. "Miss Hart, you are a woman of the arts, are you not? Could these figures not be, shall we say, open to interpretation?" And she didn't blink. "I count in bread, sir," she said evenly. "Children can't eat interpretations." The courtroom exhaled a quiet, dangerous approval. The judge's mouth twitched, almost a smile. The lawyer's ears brightened to a careful pink. He changed tactics. "Miss Hart, when you copied these figures into that tidy hand of yours, did you not in fact alter the original ledger?" "I made them legible," she said. "The numbers didn't change just because I gave them better manners. Yet they passed from the rancher's hand to yours. Is it not possible you introduced bias?" "Yes," Lila said, and the room flinched. "The bias of exactness. If you'd like to see the originals, I've brought them." She reached into her satchel and placed the ragged ranch book beside the neat one, a ducking wounded thing beside its restored twin. Ink blotted by a pump that lies every third day is still ink. A low chuckle ran across the benches. The lawyer glared. Lila did not follow the chuckle with a smile. She stood as she had at the plank, school on the porch, precise, unafraid of silence. When Elias took the stand, he did not embellish. "I saw men digging under starlight where no man digs unless he's hiding something," he said. "I saw the way the creek fell quiet after, and I saw my barn light up like it was remembering the Sunday." "Do you accuse Mr. Creed directly?" the lawyer pressed. Elias's blue eyes didn't waver. "I accuse the kind of man who signs other men's sins and then sleeps fine. If that's Mr. Creed, he'll know it better than I do. You bear him a personal grudge, do you not?" "I bear him the truth," Elias said. "Grudges are for men who don't have chores." The lawyer flushed, but the judge said nothing. Some truths need no polish. A ripple stirred near the back. A small boy stood. Hat clutched to his chest, the same boy from the fire. His mother tried to pull him down, but he shook her hand off gently. "It was me," he said, voice cracking. "They paid Pa to fetch a can from the saloon. Said it was lamp oil for the bunkhouse. Pa didn't know. I didn't know." The whole room leaned toward him, but he didn't flinch. "Mr. Kane stopped the fire. Miss Hart said I could still be better. I'm trying." The lawyer pivoted, smelling advantage in a child. "Son, you wore a scarf over your face, did you not? Perhaps you misunderstood the errand boys like to play at—" The boy's chin lifted. "I ain't playin'." The foreman said, "Teach the schoolmarm some respect." He said Mr. Kane would fold if he lost sleep. "Names," the judge said gently. The boy swallowed. "Foreman with the lip scar. Folks call him Ridge." Murmurs, quick and sharp. The judge rapped once, a sound like the end of a bad idea. "You've done enough, son. Sit." The judge cleared his throat, old eyes wet. "You've done better already," he added, softer. The boy's mother cried into her shawl, and 3 women she barely knew put their hands on her back, because some griefs are too heavy for one spine. By noon, the air in the room felt thicker than sin. The judge called a recess. Men poured outside to breathe dust instead of tension. The street shimmered with heat. Elias leaned against the porch rail, Lila beside him, both silent, both spent. The boards carried their weight like a promise kept. "You speak like a bell," he said at last, not looking at her. "You hold like a door," she replied, the ghost of a smile finding her lips. They didn't see Creed inside, pacing like a wolf in a pen, or his lawyer whispering numbers that had nothing to do with evidence. They didn't hear the lawyer advise a settlement. They didn't watch Creed dismiss the advice with a flick of his cigar, ash falling like cheap snow. When court resumed, Sheriff Dwyer brought out the map creased, smudged, damning. A saddlebag had spilled it near Dead Mare Wash after one of Creed's men fell drunk off his horse. Black ink traced lines of pipe running under property they didn't own, a tangle of theft disguised as irrigation. The judge held it up to the light and frowned. "Mr. Creed, would you care to explain?" Creed rose, spreading his hands in mock sorrow. "Gentlemen, neighbors' progress has its price. The pipes were intended to stabilize, flow, nothing more. If paperwork was lacking, that's a bureaucratic fault, not moral. As for damages, I'll pay every man in this room double for his inconvenience." A murmur rolled through the crowd, low and ugly. Elias stood before the judge could speak. "You can't pay a creek to forgive theft," he said, voice quiet but clean. "Water don't take bribes, and neither should men." Creed's face darkened. "Be careful, Kane. You've had a run of luck. Luck runs out. Then I'll walk without it," Elias said. The lawyer tried one last angle. "Your Honor, even if these lines were installed, the association bylaws, the judge said, "are not the law." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Counselor, your client is not accused of poor manners. He is accused of theft, fraud, and endangerment. You may argue intent if you wish, but the pipe argues louder." The gavel fell once, sharp as a shot. The verdict came slower, as if each word weighed more than wood could hold. Injunction granted. The pipe to be removed under marshal's supervision. Fines issued triple the offered bribes. Probation recommended for the men who had confessed and cooperated. As for Creed, temporary custody pending appeal in Santa Fe, with travel restricted and sureties posted. His eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in calculation. "You've made a powerful enemy," he hissed as the deputy took his arm, "and I've made a reason to live longer." "Then live honest," Lila said, surprising herself and everyone else. She hadn't meant to speak. The words seemed to have walked out of her chest on their own feet. The doors swung shut behind Creed with the sound of something overdue finally paid. The room stayed quiet for a heartbeat too long, as if it had to relearn speech. Then the noise erupted: applause, laughter, tears disguised as coughs. Women embraced without remembering their propriety. Men clapped shoulders, harder than necessary, to hide tenderness. Someone near the back began, "Praise God from whom," and then stopped, embarrassed, but the line hung in the air like a rope someone might yet grab. Out by the wash that evening, the townspeople gathered to see justice made visible. Under the marshal's eye, the iron pipe came up inch by stubborn inch. The men who had laid it now unlaced it, cheeks hot with a shame that looked, in that light, almost like redemption. Each section was hauled by mule and dumped beside the creek in a long metallic grave. Children threw stones that clanged against it like bells of defiance. Lila stood barefoot in the damp mud, skirt hem dark with silt, feeling the earth drink free for the first time in a year. Elias stood beside her, hat off, hair catching the evening gold. For once, neither of them had words. The first gush of liberated water hit the light like glass. Rosa laughed, full-throated, and Miguel crossed himself. Sheriff Dwyer tipped his hat toward the horizon and said, "May she run honest now." Someone struck up a fiddle. Someone else began a hymn half-remembered from a better town. The sound wove through the twilight until even the crickets paused to listen. Old man Pritchard, who hadn't walked without a cane since the winter the river took his boy, waded in up to his ankles and cried without shame. "Feels like her again," he said, and everyone knew he meant both the creek and his life. Lila watched the reflection of that new water trembling across Elias's face and thought how justice is rarely loud. It's the quiet after, when the guilty have gone, and the innocent remember how to breathe. She turned to him. "So what happens now?" "Now," he said, "we mend fences, wood and otherwise." "And Creed? Men like him don't end." They pause. "But we'll be ready." As dusk deepened, the town lit lanterns along the creek, their flames mirrored in the surface like small promises kept. Children ran with jars to catch fireflies, shouting that the light had come back. Two boys, the twins from the porch school, argued cheerfully about who'd found the brighter jar, then forgot the argument to listen to frogs gossip in the reeds. Lila felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but alignment, a sense that her life finally rhymed with itself. A woman Lila didn't know pressed a bundle of wild mint into her hands. "For your classroom," she said, "so the children remember this smell when they see sums." Lila thanked her and tucked the mint into her satchel beside the ledger. Sums and scent, proof and memory. When they rode home, the air smelled of wet dust and music. Elias drove slow, one hand on the reins, the other resting near hers on the seat. Every so often the wagon jolted and their shoulders brushed. Neither pulled away. The stars came out one by one like signatures. At the ranch, the moon was already high, pale and watchful. Lila stepped down and turned toward the open field. The creek murmured nearby, tireless and true. She thought of her uncle, of the East she had left behind, of the long chain of decisions that had led her here to a man who had chosen decency when silence would have been safer. "Elias," she said softly. He turned. "I'm proud of you." He looked at her, puzzled. For telling the truth? For surviving it? They stood there a while, listening to frogs gossip in the shallows. The night had a pulse again. Rosa's window glowed warm. Miguel's shadow crossed it once, then stilled. The cattle muttered like old men losing and finding sleep. Somewhere far off, a coyote laughed at a joke only the land understood. In the days that followed, Valor's rest began to change. Not quickly, nothing worth keeping moves that way, but undeniably. At sunup, men met at the wash with coffee tin cups and argued about headgates without raising voices. Farmers shared water without arguing first. Someone started keeping a chalkboard nailed to a cottonwood with simple columns. Draw divided by return. Children came to class clean-faced. Their mothers, smiling like dawn, had finally kept its promise. Even Ruth's boarding house filled with laughter instead of worry. It turned out people could be braver in prosperity than in fear. The marshal stayed long enough to make habit out of oversight. Pipes were measured, maps redrawn with actual consent. The Stockmen's Association emptied out and then, as if embarrassed by its own bravado, tried to refill with the men no one trusted to count to 20 with their shoes on. Sheriff Dwyer, who had once worn weariness like a second badge, started shaving closer. When he walked down Main, people nodded as if the tilt of his hat might mean something again. And still, under all that sunlight, Lila felt the echo of Creed's words, "You've made a powerful enemy lingering like thunder beyond sight." She woke sometimes to the memory of a scarfed boy and a flicker of orange against the barn's eaves, and had to place her palm flat against the window pane until present day returned. Elias rose at those noises and went to the porch, not to stand guard so much as to tell the dark he knew its tricks. One morning, a folded note appeared on the porch rail. "Mistakes happen on rough nights. Let smart men handle big problems. SC." The ink was too neat to belong to anyone but him. Elias read it twice, then burned it in the stove without comment. The flame hissed, swallowed, and moved on. Lila watched the smoke drift upward. "He'll try again. Then we'll live again," Elias said. "That's the better revenge." Rosa snorted from the table, kneading dough as if it had personally insulted her. "Living is always expensive," she said. "So is fear. I know which bill I like to pay." Small resistances became ritual. Lila kept the ledger open on a nail by the door with the day's flow penciled in, a public scripture. Elias scrawled, "No trespassing" on a board for the upper pasture, and someone no one admitted who added beneath it, in a child's careful hand, "No lying either." The sign made townsfolk laugh, then think, which is the better order? On Saturday afternoons, the twins from the neighbor's spread presented Lila with pebbles smooth, water-kissed, for the number line, they said solemnly, as if mathematics could be weighed like mercy. Lila built lessons around those stones, holding one up when a sum needed a body. When a problem refused to yield, she would roll a stone in her palm and ask the class, "What would the creek do?" Usually a child answered, "Keep going around the rock, miss." She'd nod. "Exactly. The next Sunday, they sat at the back pew of the small white church, and when the hymn began, their voices found each other without trying. The townspeople turned and smiled, the kind of smile that means we remember what you did. The preacher, a man who wore his collar like a debt and his faith like a field, set aside his prepared sermon and spoke instead about stewardship, a word that doesn't photograph well but keeps children alive. He read a line about water having no owner but many guardians, and every head bowed as if from the weight of being named. After service, Mrs. Pritchard pressed a jar of preserves into Lila's hands. "Had a dream about my boy last night," she said, eyes wet and shining. "He was laughing near the wash. Haven't dreamt that since." Lila hugged her a quick, firm thing and thought, this is what justice tastes like. Sweet, with pits. In the shade outside the church, Sheriff Dwyer cleared his throat. "Santa Fe wired," he announced to anyone within hearing, which was everyone. "Appeal's been filed. Judge says he'll hear it in the fall. Until then, keep your buckets full and your tempers empty." He looked at Elias and at Lila in turn. "And keep your records, Miss Hart. Paper will have to carry what feeling can't." "Paper's rested and ready," Lila said. On the way home, the wagon rolled past Dead Mare Wash. The water shouldered by like a laborer who had finally been paid. Elias slowed the team. "Look there," he said softly. Along the bank, watercress had returned, green enough to embarrass envy. A heron stood ankle, deep, patient as a clerk. Lila watched it, then reached and laid her hand over Elias's on the reins. He didn't move. They sat that way a long minute, two hands on one line, the team breathing cloud into the heat. They could have turned this into triumph, the kind people parade through town with flags. Instead, they took it home like bread. That evening, Ruth arrived with a basket and a rumor. The basket held peach pie. The rumor said Creed had been seen talking to a pair of strangers whose hats didn't match their stories. They smell like hired men, Ruth said, the kind who come to a town to find the part that can still be bought. Elias tore the pie with his thumb and handed Lila the larger slice. Then we keep the part that can't be bought within sight. After supper, Rosa brought out a fiddle that had belonged to Miguel's grandfather. She tuned it to the sound of the creek through the open window, and the melody that sprang up was too plain to be fancy and too honest to be ignored. Miguel took Lila's ledger from the shelf and, smiling at the absurdity, thumped a soft beat on its cover like a drum. Lila winced, then laughed, because sometimes the right instrument for a song is the wrong one for everything else. Later, when the house sighed itself toward sleep, Lila lifted the day's page and wrote, in the blank space at the bottom where totals usually go, "Justice is water that remembers its course." She capped her pen, blew the ink dry, and knew not every entry in a book had to be for men who counted only cattle. She stepped outside. The sky had dragged its hem in stars. Elias was already there, he always was when worry sharpened the night. He handed her a shawl without speech, the gesture neat and practiced, the way some men hand over a revolver. "Do you regret it?" she asked after a while. "Dragging this into daylight," he thought. "Only the time it took. The rest feels like a fence-built plum. And the appeal? Appeals are just time with paperwork. You always sound like the horizon's already told you the ending," she said, half teasing. He tilted his head, considering. "No, I just know the shape of endings I'm willing to accept." They stood until the chill reached bone, and then a little longer, as if to tell the chill it didn't have the last word. When they finally went inside, the creek kept talking, a voice you could lean on. Valor's rest might never be pure, but it had begun to be honest. That's rarer. In the margin of that night, somewhere between the crickets and the slow breath of a house that had earned its rest, a different kind of resolve took shape, quiet, domestic, stubborn. Fences would need mending, lessons would need chalk, the school door would stick in the wet and need planing again, the ledger would ask for neatness and get it, the town would be tempted toward forgetfulness, and someone would remind it, gently and repeatedly, that memory is a civic duty. And if a fresh note appeared on the porch rail one dawn, written in a hand too fine for a ranch road, they would read it, burn it, and then go about the only answer that ever humiliates malice. Living. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The schoolhouse rose, board by stubborn board, where the cottonwoods wrote their green psalms against the sky. Children carried stones in apron pockets and hat crowns, adding them to the foundation as if each rock were an oath. Lila painted the door a red that could be found from the far side of a dust squall. The paint flashed like courage in a place that rarely applauded it. Elias planed the desktop smooth until the wood admitted it was meant for hands and not splinters. When he was done, he stood back, cap in hand, and looked at the little room as a man might look at a newborn, half pride, half fear at the size of the years to come. The bell was a salvaged triangle from an old cook wagon, polished until it forgot beans and learned Latin letters. Rosa strung it with braided rawhide and said a prayer in Spanish that made even the nailheads feel blessed. Miguel hung the slate higher than any quarrel. Ruth cleaned the windows with vinegar and a strip of calendar that still insisted last year would return if given another Saturday. When the first lesson was called, Wind shouldered the wall like a curious neighbor and then, finding no scandal, moved on. Since the court's decision, the creek had learned to speak honestly again. It talked all day in a silver tongue, not wasting a syllable, and the gardens relearned generosity. The wash at dawn smelled of willow and new attempts. People said their beans came up like forgiveness, yet no one stamped the word safe on their door. In the West, even joy wears work clothes. Lila kept a calendar nailed near the red door, not to trap time but to see that it was present. She marked the days with small drawings, the outline of a cottonwood for good weather, an open eye when a child read a word clean for the first time, a crude bell when a mother came to the porch to ask if there was room for one more in the morning class. Often as not there was, because school is like soup. If you keep the pot warm, the broth will stretch. Stanton Creed stayed, because men like him mistake defeat for a delayed bill. His riders thinned, his voice lowered, but his hat still floated in the saloon mirror most evenings, and his shadow lay across the street at noon like a question nobody could afford to ignore. Sheriff Dwyer kept a saddle by the door and a coffee pot that never cooled. The marshal rode back to his district with promises about vigilance that sounded like hymns nobody quite knew the verses to. Valor's rest learned the awkward discipline of looking one another in the eye, shopkeeper to ranch hand, tanner to schoolmarm, and holding the gaze long enough for the truth to show up. On a blue morning that remembered rain without delivering it, a letter arrived with a territorial seal pressed flat by someone who had never seen a whirlwind. The envelope made the whole house straighten its shoulders. Lila slit it with the kitchen knife she used for apples, and bad news. The page inside offered land grants upriver patches of surveyed promise to teachers who would carry a school to where the map shook hands with rumor. The words were bureaucratic. Lila heard music. Elias read over her shoulder, slow and careful, not because he struggled, but because carefulness was his native language. He did not answer fast. He saw the miles threaded with river light, the long weeks when the porch lamp lit for a smaller number of chairs, the ache of home like a good boot you carry because you cannot wear it everywhere. He also saw a row of children waiting in a valley that never made it to the county ledger. He set 2 fingers on the letter's corner, as if steadying a skittish thing. "We can teach the far kids to stand up in their own names," he said finally. "Make this place run without you for part of the week. I'll ride beside you till the trail memorizes our weight." She swallowed on a laugh too bright for the room. "You do that? I call that rest," he said, and lifted the kettle from the stove because talking was thirsty work. That afternoon, she wrote a reply with the kind of penmanship that persuades paper to be decent. She asked questions about acreage and river frontage, and whether a woman could sign her own name on the deed without a man's shadow lying across the ink. The next evening, she signed the bottom with a steady hand and folded hope in thirds. So they traveled. On Mondays before wide light, they loaded the wagon, a stack of slates, a roll of maps that had been drawn by optimists, a basket of biscuits wrapped in clean cloth, a tin of chalk, a spare pair of spectacles for the boy who pretended he didn't need them, and the small violin Lila had nursed back from a funeral to a tune. Elias tied everything down the way you lash a future simple knots, double-checked. Rosa sent them off with coffee, Miguel with weather he stole from the smell of dawn. Ruth waved from the boarding house steps, a towel over one shoulder like a flag of domestic truce. The upriver trail unscrolled in the slow grammar of switchbacks. Cottonwoods kept pace for a while, then fell behind, replaced by juniper and the blue stain of far hills. Antelope watched, measured them, and ruled them harmless. When noon came hot as a dare, they pulled into a fold of shade and split an orange, as if it were a saint's relic. Lila taught from the wagon bench when the creek ran loud, and the children sat on the bank with their bare feet in the honest water, their faces bent over letters that would be theirs forever. Elias moved through the day fixing what men had believed unbreakable, a quiet presence at the edge of lessons, eyes bright when a small hand made a big sound on 3 strings and refused to call it luck. They collected stories the way some men collected debts. A girl who charted the stars on a feed sack because paper is a luxury and wonder is not. Twins who took turns wearing the same pair of shoes, and on test days went barefoot together, grinning at the dust that salted their arches. A boy who read numbers as if they could be persuaded, then learned, slowly, that numbers are less cruel than men, and the truth most people want is an answer that fits in a pocket. Lila listened to them all and made files in her heart where the drawers didn't stick. Sometimes, when lessons ran late and the wind softened, she drew a crooked staff on the slate and let the violin speak the part of the day that arithmetic could not. Children leaned in until their mouths forgot to be clever. Elias, who claimed he had no ear for music, stood by the horses rubbing a thoughtful circle into the mare's neck and looking as if some old noise in him had finally matched the world. Wednesdays brought storms that spent themselves outlining mountains. Thursdays brought home. They would rattle into the yard at dusk with a tumble of laughter and fatigue, the small violin tucked under a quilt, chalk dust on Lila's cuffs like a benediction nobody thought to charge for. Friday nights, Elias laid his tools out on a blanket like cards, and repaired what had had the audacity to be mortal hinges, pumps, that one chair Miguel favored because it didn't judge a man for sitting long. Saturdays, they walked the wash, and stacked plans the way children stack stones on the creek's lip, wobbly, upright, proud, willing to be edited by wind. The schoolhouse learned its children. It knew who came late because goats jump fences when they shouldn't, who pretended not to like reading and then borrowed the primer to hold overnight, who hid a sketch of a hawk under the desk because art is a kind of confession boys don't always know how to voice. The red door stuck in heat and sighed in rain, and every time Elias planed it smooth, he looked pleased, as if he'd taught a stubborn idea to be kind. One afternoon, halfway between summer's middle and the first rumor of harvest, a man from the territorial office arrived early, dust on his pants doing all the talking his smile refused. He had a ledger for applications and a mind for quotas. "We can grant you the parcel at Needle Bend," he said, tapping the page the way city men knock on doors that are already open. "It comes with conditions." He named them: a minimum number of students, attendance records, quarterly reports which the river would not carry. "We'll meet your numbers," Lila said, seeing faces, not figures. Elias nodded, as if measuring a fence line he meant to keep mended. The man tipped his hat to efficiency and rode away with the look of someone who will file a favorable report and never come to visit the school when the stove goes cold in March. They announced none of this at church. They did not yet claim a thing they had not stood inside. But the town felt the weather of it. The children ran their fingers over the red door, as if memorizing it, in case the path their teacher took required them to build another. Rosa began to save flour sacks with prettier printing, because children write straighter on paper that respects itself. Miguel tuned the mule, a skill he claimed was real, and Lila refused to ask about. On a long, gentle evening, Elias set a ring in Lila's open palm. Silver, plain as the truth, round as a habit. Ruth wept the way practical women do. One tear, wiped with the heel of the hand, then a small laugh to keep the room from believing it could turn soft without supervision. The boy from the fire, who had turned himself into a helper, stood tall and silent at the back, eyes bright as new tin. They didn't choose a date, because dates are city things, and belong to calendars that have never seen a sky like this. They chose a season instead, after harvest, when hands were free and gratitude didn't have to shout to be heard. In the days between promise and season, the land tested every vow. Elias limped more when the wind switched, but he did it with the cheerfulness of a man who counts blessings by the pound. Lila wore a groove between house and schoolhouse. The porch boards learned her weight and approved of it. Sheriff Dwyer found a cache of chain and bolts near Dead Mare Wash and hauled it into daylight like a fisherman bringing up a stubborn truth. Creed watched from doorways as if planning were a sacrament no one else understood. Sometimes, small omens came wrapped in ordinary cloth. A calf born breech and turned by Elias's quiet patience, standing at last on knees that couldn't yet decide which way to be brave. A letter from a mother upriver scrawled with ink that had learned humility from water. "Please come. My boy wants numbers. My girl wants letters. We want both of them to want something right." A worn Bible slid across the schoolhouse desk by a child who said, "Miss, can this book count as two?" And Lila answering, "Depends on how you read it." Oh. One night, lightning walked the ridge and held its breath, unwilling to let go the rain it had been built to carry. Lila stood on the porch, counting between flash and afterward, measuring distance the way you measure hope, by sound delayed. Elias came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets, posture like a comma, pausing, connecting. "After we bring the hay in," he said, "we'll ride farther, see Needle Bend with our own eyes. If the river speaks welcome, we'll listen." How far is farther?" she asked. "As far as the children wait," he said. They smiled, not at each other so much as with the same mouth the future had borrowed. The next morning in town, Creed's hat brim tilted toward Lila just enough to insult the Sunday. "Ambitious," he said, and the word crawled. "Schools make soft men. Men make soft men," she answered. "A schoolteacher's patience salted with a ranch wife's steel. Schools make readers. Readers make choices." "Oh." He touched the brim again and left as if he had concluded something. Elias watched him go with the expression of a man who ties a knot in a string, so he will remember what not to forget. They kept building their week. Departures that felt like proof, returns that felt like mercy. And then, because the West refuses to grow predictable, the river dropped 3 inches in a week, and the creek brought a rumor that the Upper Ditch Company planned to borrow water the way a wolf borrows a lamb. Meetings were called. Tempers rehearsed their parts. Lila copied down minutes that smelled of sweat and duty. Elias stood at the back of the hall and measured his breath so other men could measure theirs. When it came time to choose delegates to ride and argue with the ditch bosses, his name went up without vote. He did not look at Lila when he nodded. He did not need to. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of the last West town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. The ride to the meeting took a day and a part of another. The talk took longer than law or weather intended. Paper argued with paper in a room that smelled of ledger ink and unwashed ambition. A map was unrolled so many times its rivers began to look embarrassed. Elias spoke second, then last, the way a man does when he knows the middle will be trampled. He did not threaten. He measured sentences with the same patience he gave to fence posts and cattle berths. Lila watched men who had scoffed at school nod as if they had finally learned their letters and found them not to be a trap. In the end, paper did what paper can. It promised. The men came home with ink on their hands and a schedule of fair draws that looked good enough to stand on until a fresh wind blew. Lila read it twice, then folded it once and set it under the jar of beans on the shelf. "We'll keep our own books," she said. "And the river will keep hers." Days slipped forward, hemming summer to autumn with a loose but faithful stitch. Harvest stacked the fields into tidy, fragrant walls. Children were dismissed 2 afternoons a week to help. Lila turned it into arithmetic because nothing teaches multiplication like bales. The red door stuck in the early wet, and Elias planed it smooth again without being asked. A boy fell asleep over his reader with his palm pressed to the page like a promise. She let him sleep, because sometimes the mind learns better with the eyes closed. The mule refused a hill, and then accepted it, because Rosa spoke to him in a grammar that is not written down. Evenings tasted like cider, and the first argument between frost and grass. Lila mended shirts by lamp, the needle arguing gently with the cloth. Elias brought in a bucket of apples from the tree that insisted on thriving by the barn scar. He lined them on the table by size as if he could talk order into the coming months. "Men sort things so they feel less mortal," Ruth teased when she saw the row. "Let him," Lila said, and kissed her finger where the needle had reminded her of blood. The children began practicing for a harvest recital in a room that borrowed grandeur from the persistence of their breath. Lupe would recite a poem about a river that chose honesty over speed. Tomas, cheeks set in a seriousness he had inherited from his father, would play a 3-note tune on the violin with the gravity of a funeral and the hope of a sunrise. The twins argued about whether they should present their rock collection, then decided rocks didn't need applause. Lila wrote their names on a program she folded from a catalog page, each letter as even as the chance she believed they deserved. On a soft dawn that smelled like copper and apples, they hitched the wagon and faced a road narrow as a hymn. Behind them, the red door, the creek with its mended honesty, the barn that remembered fire and chose work, the porch with 2 chairs and a third holding a hat. Ahead, hills folding into one another like spines, a bend in the river where rumor claimed the stones could be read like a book if you learned the alphabet of water. Lila turned once to look back. Elias watched her watching and nodded as if giving a benediction to the life already earned. The first mile was a rehearsal for the courage the second would demand. The team leaned and accepted the judgment of the traces. A magpie scolded them for existing. A rabbit changed its mind twice and then chose not to be a proverb. Lila counted creek bends out loud, the way a sailor counts breaths on a hard crossing. At the second bend, Elias slowed the wagon and pointed. Needle Bend did not announce itself with grandeur. It was a humble elbow of river where the current learned to be thoughtful. Cottonwoods leaned in to listen. On the inner bank, a small rise stood clear of flood marks, tufted with grass that looked like a promise if you were willing to mow it. They stepped down. Boots met soil and both parties approved. Lila went to the water first and knelt, cupping her hand into a mirror until a small sky sat there, trembling. She sipped, not to own, but to agree. "It speaks welcome," she said. Elias walked the rise, measuring width with his stride, corners with his eye. He stooped, pinched a fist of dirt, and let it fall. "Good drainage," he said. "Not so good you forget the river is a neighbor." He looked out at the bend and smiled in that sideways way of his that always looked like humility, winning around. "All right, Needlebend, we'll try not to teach you anything you don't need." They sat on the wagon tongue, passing cheese and bread and the last of the apples as if communion had been reinvented for hunger. Lila unfolded the letter from the territorial office and read the conditions again. They did not scowl. They were manageable, like thrift. Elias wrote a list in the back of the ledger: posts, roofing, stove, small, bell, ink, flour sacks for copybooks. Lila added, patience, warm socks, one extra chair for the child who arrives without a plan. He looked over and drew a small square beside her words so he could tick it later, perhaps twice. They returned home with River on their boots and a plan in their pockets. The next days were chores gone wholly, mending harness, trimming boards, sanding edges until splinters gave up their ambition. Miguel drove posts upriver where the ground thought about arguing and then didn't. Rosa stitched curtains from flour sacks so the new room could blush without apology. Ruth offered the front room stove that had once burned too hot for a husband who liked his coffee mean. "It's time it cooked for gentler mouths," she said. The harvest recital came the night before the last cutting. The room smelled of dust, starch, and a brave attempt at cinnamon. Mothers wore their good shawls. Fathers had shaved as if dignity could be made to behave with steel. Lila welcomed them with the poise of a woman who knows that grace is most needed where there is least room for it. When Lupe recited her river poem, the men in the back pretended to adjust their boots. When Tomas lifted the violin and asked the universe for mercy with 3 notes, Sheriff Dwyer swallowed and stared at the floorboards as if someone had written scripture between the knots. Afterward, they ate pie from tin plates and pretended not to count slices. The boy who had once carried a can of oil stood in the doorway as if he had to ask the house for permission to forgive him. Lila walked to him, handed him a plate with the largest piece, because fairness is not always the same as equality, and said, "You help me with the benches tomorrow?" He nodded, speech blocked by sugar and relief. The nights that followed brought thin frost and thick stars. Elias woke twice to the sound of coyotes arguing with their dignity. The second time, he found Lila awake, standing by the window, her hand on the glass like a woman greeting an old friend. "I was naming the children who'll sit at Needle Bend," she said without turning. "Names I know and don't. There'll be one who refuses his name," he said. "We'll learn it anyway." "We always do," she said. The morning of the final haying, light fell into the valley like a kind judgment. Men bent to scythes, women to baskets, children to a collective pretense that they were not getting in the way. Creed's riders watched from the ridge like wolves considering vegetarianism and finding it the wrong religion. They kept their distance. Lila felt their attention like cold cloth and chose to give all her warmth to the work at hand. The red door at the schoolhouse stood open to let the room remember the smell of labor done right. By midday, the stacks were high and square, and Elias called a halt to save backs that needed to wake willing tomorrow. He climbed onto the top bale like a mock pulpit and looked down at a congregation too tired to be accused of anything. "We feed the land so the land feeds us," he said, "and we keep score in bellies, not banknotes." There were cheers, not because he'd said something new, but because he'd said the thing everyone believed and forgot in the usual order. That evening, after the kitchen had found a way to be grateful for limited pans, Lila and Elias walked down to the wash. The sky had started its red arithmetic. The creek shouldered on, no longer a sermon, just a life. "In another world," Lila said, "we'd have moved to a city. You'd have run a warehouse or a factory floor. I'd have taught Latin declensions to girls who'd never need them. She smiled into the water. We might have had seats at the theater and no calluses. In another world, Elias said, I'd have been good at keeping books and bad at breathing. He tipped his hat back and considered the horizon that had become a friend. I like this one better. They did not speak of forever. Forever is a town word, too tidy for dirt. They spoke of next, which is how forever happens when you're not grandstanding. He clicked to the team. The wheels found the ruts. The wagon sang the song all wagons know. This is heavy and worth it. They spent the next week making bundles of learning for needlebend. Rosa stitched small bags from a retired shirt and filled each with a stub of pencil, 2 slate chips, and a loop of string for counting. Miguel planed 2 boards to make a traveling desk that clipped onto the wagon sides. Ruth cut a straw mattress to fit a corner of the upriver room. For any child, she said, who needs a place to pretend the world is kind for an hour. The day they set the first pole at Needle Bend, a hawk circled until it decided this was not about it. Elias measured, Lila held, and the line ran straight as the wishes of the patient. A boy from a ranch 2 miles above approached, hat in his hands, and asked if lessons would include drawing. If the river cooperates, Lila said. He pointed with the shy confidence of the sure. It will. She likes it best when people pay attention. Lila added charcoal to the supply list and underlined it. Creed made 2 last attempts to sour the season. The first came as a rumor with Boots, a card game at the saloon where a stranger offered to buy the schoolhouse for a church social room, papers ready, money down. The second came as a smile with teeth, a note at the church pew, folded neat, scent of a cologne that asked too much of lilac. Public opinion is a tide. Don't drown. Lila placed the card under the leg of a wobbly desk at school and found she liked the steadiness it purchased. As the first frost burned the edges of squash leaves to lace, the letter from the territory arrived with the stamp that means a yes is about to learn its chores. The land at Needle Bend was theirs to steward. The deed named Lila Hart in the first line, spelled right, as if luck had practiced. Elias read it twice, and then a third time, not out of doubt, but joy's awkward cousin, disbelief. He set the paper down and touched the back of her hand with one finger, like a man making certain of a pulse. You'll hang that in the school, he said. Where children can see a woman's name keep its own company. They took the deed to church and tucked it into the hymnal at Psalm 126, not out of piety but because the line about sowing in tears and reaping in joy fit like a jacket passed down and found to still be worn. Ruth cried twice, once in the pew and once at home, the second time because she had burned the beans from remembering the first. The morning they moved the first books upriver, fog laid a white hand on the ground. It lifted in polite increments. The road showed up, then the grass, then the river, then the faces of the children waiting as if they had invented patience on purpose. Lila climbed down, handed out slate chips like sacrament, and asked who had spent the week watching the sky on purpose. All hands. She nodded, accepted the truth of their answers, and wrote the word observe on the board, as if she had named not a task, but a citizenship. They did not build all at once. Some roofs prefer to be courted. They taught, then hammered, fed children, then set stones, sang, then measured. The bell from the cook wagon learned a new voice at Needle Bend, bright and almost shy. When it rang, cattle lifted their heads, as if to say humans could sometimes be trusted to mean well. The horizon did its old magic trick, stepping away just enough to keep them curious, staying close enough to keep them from despair. Now and then a cloud would shape itself into a ship because the universe likes to tease plains people. They waved anyway. The mule brayed as if to correct their theology. At night, back at Kane's mercy, the house made its soft inventory of sounds. Rosa's laugh. Miguel's murmur to the calf with a pride problem, the creek's unremarkable fidelity. Lila set her head against Elias's shoulder, not as a question but a punctuation mark that meant continue. He read the sign.